Today's video is brought to you by our sponsor Card Kingdom, and right now you can pre-order Zendikar Rising by heading over to cardkingdom.com. Hello everyone, it's Seth, probably better known as Saffron Olive, and it's time for another daily dose of Zendikar Rising spoilers, and we have officially reached week 2 of Zendikar Rising spoilers, and we got a ton of cards to talk about today, some really unique mythics, some good rares, our exclusive MTG Goldfish preview card, so let's jump right into it, talk about some sweet new Zendikar Rising cards, starting with our exclusive MTG Goldfish preview card. Thanks to Wizards for hooking us up Lithoform Engine, and this card, oh my goodness, it is pretty crazy, but Tomer and I already did a big breakdown of this card over at MTG Goldfish Commander, which there'll be a card popping up somewhere right about now that you should check out. So we're not going to go super in-depth because we have so many cards to talk about today. But Lithoform Engine, 4 mana legendary artifact. You can pay 2, tap it to copy an activated or triggered ability you control. Pay 3, tap it, copy an instant or sorcery you control. Pay 4, tap it, copy a permanent spell you control. The copy comes into play as a token. So Lithoform Engine, it is essentially a Rings of Brighthurst / Tyrannic Resonator, 2 commander staples, mixed with a Mirari, sort of, which is not exactly a commander staple, but it does see commander play, mixed with really an entirely new ability. We've never had a mechanic or an ability that can copy a permanent spell on the stack. It's similar to like Minion Reflector or Mythos of Aluna, but repeatable. So this means that Lithoform Engine, it essentially combines together a bunch of really playable stuff, especially in the commander format, where this feels like an all-star to me. If you're playing Rings of Brighthurst Tyrannic Resonator, you probably want Lithoform Engine. If you're a spell copy deck, you probably want Lithoform Engine. If you're a Panharmonicon or Yarok deck, you probably want Lithoform Engine to copy permanents and get more triggers out of them. So this card, I think, is absolutely insane. The craziest shenanigans, and probably the sweetest thing you do with the card, is go off with Anointed Processions and Double League Seasons and Primal Vigors. To me, the most exciting ability is definitely that last one, because it's a new one that we've never seen before, copying a permanent spell. This means you can like play an Anointed Procession, and you could do this in Historic even, play an Anointed Procession, copy it on the stack with Lithoform Engine, so you get a token copy of it, which will trigger itself, because it triggers whenever a token comes into play, so you get 2, and then you get the original, so that's 3 Anointed Processions, and then you're set to just absolutely go off, which I think is really, really cool. Otherwise, as far as standard is concerned, this does offer a lot of just weird random value. You can like copy your Fabled Passage trigger to get 2 lands. You can copy Planeswalker activated abilities. You can copy any of your spells. You can copy big creatures like Elder Gargorath or copy its triggered ability, so it might actually have a chance in standard. It's a really weird card. It just does so much, and it's not like super efficient at any one thing, but it does so much and has so much flexibility. There's gotta be a way to make it broken. So that's Lithoform Engine. That's our exclusive Goldfish preview. Definitely check out the preview video over at MTG Goldfish Commander, where me and Tomer go in depth on the card. And thanks again to Wizards for hooking us up with a really sweet spoiler. Next on our list, we have another sweet colorless mythic, Forsaken Monument. So Eldrazi, obviously not part of Zendikar Rising, but the remnants are still there from our last visit. 5 mana legendary artifact, colorless creatures you control get +2/+2. Whenever you tap a permanent for a colorless mana, you get an extra colorless mana, and when you cast a colorless spell, you gain 2 life. So this card, it's obviously very powerful. Essentially, it's another mana doubler, and I know we've had endless troubles with mana doubling spells like Wilderness Reclamation, like Fires of Invention, like Nissa in Standard. Thankfully, Forsaken Monument, it is narrow, especially in Standard. Like, it's 5 mana, it only doubles your colorless mana, which is a big restriction. So this card, step 1, it's kind of a tempered steel, essentially a way more expensive, but also colorless tempered steel. So that means your Stonecoil Serpents or any other artifact creatures are getting +2/+2. Your Eldrazi, including your Devoid Eldrazi, which are technically colorless colored cards, still get +2/+2. So you can just play a bunch of cheap artifact creatures, Eldrazi, pump them, make them big. But by far the most exciting ability on Forsaken Monument is turning any of your colorless mana sources into Eldrazi temples, essentially, into ancient tubes, whatever comparison you want to think of, but essentially all your wastes or anything else that makes colorless mana are going to tap for twice as much mana, which is really powerful. Like, in theory, you play this on turn 5 with 5 lands, you untap the next turn, you're going to have 10 mana if you're playing all colorless sources, which is a huge restriction. Like, keep that in mind. You do got to be playing a bunch of colorless lands, and I think that is the biggest issue with Standard. Right now, we don't have an easy way and a bunch of good ways to make colorless mana. Like, I guess you can play a bunch of, like, Bonder's Enclaves and Animal Sanctuaries and Radiant Fountains, but we don't really have, like, dual lands that tap for colors of mana and colorless mana. So I feel like this card is not especially designed for Standard, at least our current Standard. Who knows what'll change in the next 2 years as we get more sets. On the other hand, when you get back to older formats, there are some sweet options. Like, all of a sudden, the Pain lands become really, really good. You can tap them for colored mana. You gotta take a damage, but whatever. But also for double colorless mana. So you're essentially getting a ton of Ancient Tubes if you're playing the Pain lands. Also, there's Tron lands and Ghost Quarters and other playable utility lands that happen to make colorless mana. So I think the main home for this card, in the place that I'm very confident it's going to see play essentially every time, is in colorless commander decks. In colorless commander decks, remember, your lands have to abide by the color identity restrictions of the format. So that means if you're playing Kozilek, or you're playing Traxos, or Karn Silver Golem, you naturally have to play a million colorless lands in your deck. That's how it works in the format. So in a deck like that, this card is insane. It's a way you can double your mana that you just really didn't have before, and especially since some of the most powerful colorless commanders are Eldrazi, and they tend to be really expensive, Forsaken Monument seems absolutely perfect, a staple for any colorless commander deck. Like, I think literally 100% of the time, if you're built around a colorless commander, you want Forsaken Monument in your deck. The other thing that's worth pointing out is it also has some combo potential with Basalt Monolith. So remember, Forsaken Monument, the mana doubling triggers on any permanent, not just lands. So Basalt Monolith, it taps for 3 mana. We'll have to see the official rulings on this. My guess is, with a Forsaken Monument out, you'll get 4 mana. I don't think you get an extra mana for every colorless mana. I think it's just 1 colorless mana, no matter how much you tap the permanent for. That's how it reads to me. So I think you'll get 4 mana when you tap Basalt Monolith, but it's only 3 to untap it. So Basalt Monolith, Forsaken Monument, together, infinite mana combo, infinite colorless mana combo, which plays 2 cards you probably already want in your deck, especially if you're a colorless commander deck. You already want both of these cards, so it's kind of a free roll that you might accidentally just make infinite mana. So Forsaken Monument, even though I'm skeptical of mana doublers and very scared of them over the past year, this is the kind of mana doubler I can get behind. It is very narrow, it is very powerful, but you have to be in a specific deck to make it work. There is a cost to having a bunch of colorless sources in your deck, and as a creature pump ability, it's a little bit expensive. You kind of want your anthems to be like in the 2 or 3 mana range rather than the 5 mana range, even though it is a double anthem. And then the life gain is just a nice little bonus. So I feel like this is very clearly a colorless commander deck card with combo potential in those decks you played 100% of the time. Otherwise, we'll have to see. Maybe there's some other ways with the Pain lands or utility lands to take advantage of it. But I think in general, staple for colorless commander, and we'll see if anything else actually happens with Forsaken Monument. Next on our list, we have a new Akiri. Akiri, Fearless Voyager, 3 mana 3/3 legendary core warrior. Whenever you attack a player with 1 or more equipped creatures, draw a card, and you can pay 1 and unattach an equipment from a creature you control. And if you do, you get to tap it and give it indestructible until end of turn. So the cost is kind of high as far as removing your equipment, but giving you some protection for your creatures with equipment. So Akiri, this is our second version, and our new version, it works pretty well with the old version, which also cares about equipment for the most part. I mean, technically it just cares about artifacts, but it tends to be an equipment commander. So as far as Standard is concerned, Akiri, I think it's okay. I think the question is there enough good equipment to make it work? We know Embercleave is really good. We know Shadow Spear can be good. We've seen some attempts at new equipment that might be good enough from Zendikar Rising. If you have a bunch of equipment on your deck, Akiri's going to be great. You can snag it with the new Nahiri since it's a warrior, which is a nice bonus, so warrior synergy is added in. I mean, you only really need to attack with 1 creature a turn with an equipment to be drawing an extra card each turn, which is actually very powerful, not even to mention the ability to protect your equipped creatures with the other ability. So if there is an equipment deck in Standard, Akiri, probably going to be a big part of it, although there still is a question as to whether an equipment deck will actually work. I just tend to be skeptical because traditionally equipment decks, outside of like Stoneforge Mystic eras, and like other broken cranial plating, Mirrodin eras, traditionally haven't been that good in Standard, at least recently, but maybe Akiri combined with all this new Zendikar Rising stuff will break the mode. In Modern, I think there's the slightest chance that Akiri sees play. Like, it does seem good in some sort of Boros Stoneforge Mystic style deck, so maybe there's a direction to head there. On the other hand, the place that I feel like Akiri is definitely going to be an all-star is in Commander. I think Akiri shows up in the 99 of other equipment decks. If you're building like Zerta with equipment, Zergo, Akiri, you name it, if you're in the colors, this is going to be a great addition to the deck because Akiri, remember, the way it's worded, you only draw a card for each player you attack, no matter how many creatures you attack with. But in Commander, you can split up your equipped creatures, go attacking different players, and draw up to 3 cards a turn, making it sort of this weird equipment-y powered down Edric or something, which can actually be very powerful when you have multiple players to attack. I also think Akiri is probably the best Boros equipment commander, which is a color typically associated with having equipments, but hasn't had a really great super equipment-focused commander. This is going to be the new leader of Boros equipment decks, I think, in the Commander format. So a card that I think's got a shot in Standard, depending on the power of the equipment deck, maybe the slightest chance in Modern, and just great in Commander, in the 99 of other decks, and as a leader of your Boros equipment deck. Next on our list, we have a really interesting black mythic, Scourge of the Sky Glaive. So a 2-mana star demon that has kicker of 5. So you can cast it for 2 mana or for 7 mana. When you cast it, if you kicked it, each player loses half of their life rounded up, so potentially a lot of damage going around, and its power and toughness is equal to 20 minus the highest life total among players. So essentially, this could theoretically be a 2-mana 19/19. If each player is at 1 life, that would be 20 minus 1, making it a 19/19 for 2 mana. Of course, that is Magical Christmas Land. It's not always going to be anywhere close to that, and it does come with a lot of risk because, let's say the highest life total is 20, you can't cast this, or it's going to die. Or if it's 30 and you're playing against a life gain deck, then you're in all kinds of trouble with Scourge of the Sky Glaives. Although, again, it does kind of have a bit of a safety valve, where if you get to that 7-mana kicker, that should at least get people low enough where you're going to be able to play your Scourge of the Sky Glaives without it dying, and potentially, like, let's say each player's at 20, you kick this, everyone goes down to 10, then you have a 10/10 for 7, counting the kicker, which is still a pretty fine deal. So Scourge of the Sky Glaives, it's kind of reminiscent of Death Shadow. That's probably the easiest comparison as another card that cares about life total. The difference is Scourge of the Sky Glaives doesn't just care about your life total. Part of the reason Death Shadow is so powerful is all it cares about is your life. So if you can just aggressively fetch and shock, you can lose life really quickly and get your Death Shadow online. Scourge of the Sky Glaives, those same tricks only halfway work. Like, yes, getting your life down will help power up Scourge of the Sky Glaives, but since it triggers based on the highest life total, you really need to damage your opponent in one way or another too. So as far as Standard is concerned, I think that's actually the worst format for Scourge of the Sky Glaives, although there are some pieces that make me think that maybe you could make it work. I mean, we have Castle Lockwayne, Treacherous Blissig, eventually I'm sure we're going to get a black mythic land that'll come into play tap for 3 life, so those are cards that allow you to get your own life total down, and then if you're just playing aggressive black stuff, 1-drops, getting in early damage, you can get your opponent's life total down, and then turn Scourge of the Sky Glaives into a pretty big threat pretty quickly. Although, there's one huge, massive problem with Scourge of the Sky Glaives, in Standard in specific, but in other formats as well, and that is Uro Titan of Nature's Wrath. So, the risk of Scourge of the Sky Glaives, unlike Death Shadow, again, that only cares about your life total, is if your opponent can gain life and get their life total back up to 20, you're going to lose your Scourge of the Sky Glaives, and everyone's playing Uro, which just incidentally gains life. We've seen so many games where people are at 26 life, 29 life, just from Uroing and kind of stalling out the board, which is going to be really risky. I imagine you're like, haha, I got each player down to 17 with my, whatever, pain land, and then hitting my opponent with a couple creatures, play my Scourge of the Sky Glaives, and your opponent's like, sure, Uro, gain 3, go up to 20, your Scourge dies, I still get my Uro trigger, I have an Uro in the graveyard, so that is a big risk, and that is the biggest reason reason I'm a little skeptical of Scourge in Standard. Like, the life gain is an issue. It isn't super easy to lose your life total while also damaging your opponent's life total. On the other hand, if we go back to Modern, I feel like there is potential for Scourge there, and that's the format where I'm most excited for this card. We have the Death Shadow tricks, fetching out untapped Shockland, Street Race to lose our own life total, and something as simple as like turn 1, Polluted Delta, crack it for Blood Crypt, Lightning Bolt your face is going to put both players down to 17, and that means you can play your Scourge. It's a 3-3, which isn't insane, but it should grow throughout the game unless you run into the Uro matchups, Soul Sister, some other life gain style deck. It should keep growing because your opponent's probably playing Fetchlands and Shocklands too, because that's what the format's about. So if you can get it to like a 3-3, a 5-5, and then trust that it's going to grow, it does have a lot of potential. Plus, I don't know, once in a while you're going to get to 7 mana and be able to kick it. The other interesting thing I wanted to mention about this card is that Star works in other zones. This was actually confirmed by Wizards on Twitter. So let's say you get yourself up to 25 life, and you get a Scourge of the Sky Glaives in the graveyard. You can Nethroi. Nethroi says, whenever this creature mutates, return any number of target creatures with total power 10 or less from your graveyard to the battlefield. Well, if you target Scourge, it's actually going to give you more power to reanimate with other creatures. So instead of being able to get back 10 power worth of stuff, you can actually target Scourge, which is going to be, let's say, -5 power. So then you'll be able to get back 15 power worth of other stuff in a really weird quirk of how the rules work. So that's a cool trick to keep in mind. I don't know how practical that is, but if you're playing Commander or even some janky Standard deck, it would be pretty sweet to try to get to like 40 life and be able to mutate back even more stuff with Nethroi, taking advantage of Scourge's negative power in the graveyard. So Scourge of the Sky Glaives, little skeptical about this one in Standard. I think maybe there's a home in some sort of like mono black aggro or what they used to call suicide black deck where you're trying to hurt yourself, you're being really aggressive hurting your opponent, trying to get the life totals low enough that you can get your Scourge down, and then maybe Scourge will be really good. I'm just skeptical because of Uro and how prevalent it is and the incidental life gain it provides, but in Modern, I think it definitely has a shot to be really good in Death Shadow style shells, and because of that weird graveyard quirk of potentially having negative power and toughness, who knows what other synergies that opens up beyond Nethroi. We also got this card, Wayward Guide Beast. So Wayward Guide Beast, probably better known as the worst Goblin Guide of all time. 1 mana 2/2, trample, haste. Whenever it deals combat damage to a player, you have to return a land you control to its owner's hand. So essentially, you play this on turn 1, get in a hit with your hasty Goblin Guide-esque, even trampling, better Goblin Guide, 1-drop. The problem is, you're going to have to bounce your land drop back to your hand, which is incredibly, incredibly punishing. Like, with Goblin Guide, sure, you're giving your opponent a free land once in a while, but that's not really a big deal. The idea is you're going to be so aggressive that the card advantage Goblin Guide gives your opponent isn't a big deal. Wayward Guide Beast, if you play this at attack on turn 1 and have to pick up your first land, that means on turn 2, you can replay that land, you still only have a 1-drop. I guess maybe if you play another Wayward Guide Beast, you can get around the drawback by not having lands. Broke it. But really, it's just very, very punishing to the point where I think it's close to being unplayable. Like, you play this on turn 1, and I don't think you can attack with it. And if there's one thing we know about Goblin Guide, the main reason you play it is to attack with it on turn 1, so you can get in 4 damage, 6 damage over the first turns of the game before it dies. Wayward Guide Beast, it's like a Goblin Guide, except you probably can't attack with it till like turn 3 or something in most decks. That said, maybe there's some synergies for it. Being able to return a land from the battlefield to your hand could theoretically be an upside in some situations. Maybe you're trying to repeatedly trigger landfall, like Ukum Hellhound, Brushfire Elemental, creatures that get bigger when a land comes into play. With a Wayward Guide Beast, sure, you're going to make sure that you always have a land in hand. You attack with it, you get to pick up a land. It is a little awkward that it happens at the end of combat, so you can't play the land to trigger your stuff that turn, but it will give you a land for the next turn and set you up to play a land for sure, even if you don't have one in hand, trigger all your landfall stuff, make it bigger, get in more damage, pick up the land again with Wayward Guide Beast. So while I'm very skeptical that a Goblin Guide that probably can't attack on turn 1 or turn 2 could be good, if there's any shell that could take advantage of it, it probably involves this landfall stuff. And the same thing is kind of true in Modern. Like, again, we got Akum Hellhounds, we got Steplinks, we got Sky Cave Pickaxe. We've talked about the possibility of some sort of landfall zoo deck in Modern, just super duper ultra aggressive. Maybe Wayward Guidebeast can be a part of it, although it's a little bit awkward here as well because mostly you want to play fetch lands. You just want as many fetch lands as possible to trigger your landfall stuff. And picking up a fetch land means you didn't crack the fetch land to get another landfall trigger, but maybe there's some potential there. All in all, though, this reads almost like a card that should be insanely good. Like, if you stopped after the mana cost, power, toughness, and mechanics, trample and haste, like a 1 mana 2/2 trample and haste, that would be insane. That's a better Goblin Guide. That would be a great card. On the other hand, the drawback is just so severe that I think this card is probably going to be pretty close to unplayed across formats. If it does have a chance, maybe some sort of landfall aggro deck where picking up a land can be an upside. But even there, like, if you can't attack the first 2 turns, by the time you do start attacking, your opponent probably has some sort of blocker for your Wayward Guidebeast because a 2/2, even with trample, isn't super exciting on like turn 3. It's probably been stonewalled by something by then. So it's really hard for me to figure out a way to actually make this card good, even if it does have a nice little callback to one of the best red 1-drops of all time in Goblin Guide. We also got a really sweet blue uncommon double face modal land, Salundi Vision. So 3 mana instant. Look at the top 6 cards of your library. You can snag an instant or sorcery to put in your hand. The rest go on the bottom of your library. And of course, the other side is just a land that makes blue mana, comes into play tapped. So Salundi Vision, probably the clearest comparison is like Peer Through Depths. Peer Through Depths only goes 5 cards deep. It does cost 1 less mana, but Peer Through Depths is a card that does occasionally see play in decks that are digging to find specific combo pieces, especially in Storm style decks. So Salundi Visions could fill in that role. On the other hand, I kind of like this card as a control card as well. In control, yes, stuff like Anticipate can dig for lands, which is part of the upside. On the other hand, Salundi Vision, it is a land. So you have a land that can also be a way to dig through your deck to find a counter spell, a wrath, and 6 cards is pretty deep for 3 mana instant speed. So I think this card has potential in like standard control style decks, maybe some mid-range like spell heavy decks, and who knows, maybe it shows up in something like Storm in Modern, some other sort of spell-based combo deck. Although, in a deck like Storm in Modern, a tap land and being 3 mana is a pretty big drawback. It might be in a deck like Modern, you just value the speed and efficiency of something like Peer Through Depths. So we'll have to see where it shakes out. But worst case, this feels like a really sweet standard card to dig through, find your pieces in a control deck, and then close out the game with your Dream Trawler or whatever. Next on our list, we have Nahiri's Lithoforming, and this card's really unique. So 2 red and X for a sorcery that lets you sack X lands. For each land you sacrifice, you get to draw a card, and you can play X additional lands this turn, except they enter the battlefield tap, but whatever. So essentially, you can sort of do a weird sort of red scape shift style effect. I mean, there's a lot more variants, a lot more mana, but essentially you can cast this for a bunch of mana, sack a bunch of your lands, hopefully draw into new lands, put those lands into play, while drawing some other cards along the way. The question is, why would you want to do this? Like, even in the best case scenario, where you sacrifice a bunch of lands, draw enough lands to replace them, like, what are you really getting out of that deal? Like, what do you do with this card? Because it feels like you're not really making any progress. Let's say you sacrifice 6 lands, you draw 6 lands, you put those lands into play, nothing happened, essentially. So what do you do to take advantage in Nahiri's Lithoforming? So probably the simplest trick, at least as far as standard is concerned, is just use it with Landfar. Like, imagine Morag for your Akum on the battlefield, which gives you an extra combat for every land that comes into play. So you get down your Morag, then you cast this for all your mana, sack all your lands, put a bunch of lands into play, get a ton of combats, and essentially just win the game, hopefully, by attacking. Same with like Lotus Cobra. You can make a bunch of mana for your lands coming into play. Falith can make some massive plants. So I think landfall shenanigans is the simplest, and I think that's why this card is in the set, to be a big landfall payoff, especially for expensive landfall threats. If you're playing a bunch of like Akum Hellhounds and 1-drops, it loses a little bit of its appeal because it's kind of an expensive card, but if you're playing the big landfall threats, I think Nahiri's Lithoforming actually really powerful. The other way to take advantage of this, especially in older formats, so we're talking like Historic and Pioneer and Modern and Commander, is cards that let you play lands from your graveyard with the help of stuff like Splendid Reclamation, Guardian, Mending of Dominaria, World Shaper that just return all your lands from the graveyard to the battlefield, you can turn this into a pretty crazy ramp spell, where you take in Nahiri's Lithoforming, sacrifice all your lands, hopefully replace them with the lands that you draw, and then get all the lands you sacrifice back into play, essentially like doubling your amount of lands on the battlefield with a little bit of luck. You can do it in a slow way with Crucible of Worlds as well, where you're getting back one land a turn. So land graveyard synergy is probably number 2 with Nahiri's Lithoforming. Some of the same tricks you can do with Scapeshift, honestly. Then we have going deep with Nahiri's Lithoforming, which would be using it to get flip lands in your graveyard. So let's say you have Shatter Skull the Hammer Pass on the battlefield, but you really need a removal spell. In theory, you can use Nahiri's Lithoforming to sacrifice your Shatter Skull, get it in the graveyard. Then, since in the graveyard it's going to count the spell half, you could use like Lord Rockus or Chaomancer to get Shatter Skull smashing back to your hand. Then you can take and cast it as a removal spell. So weird shenanigans with lands that are also spells. You can do it with the creature lands as well, like sacrifice one of the creature-y flip lands and then Gravedigger it back to your hand or whatever. So that's a sweet synergy as well. So Nahiri's Lithoforming, it's a really weird card. It's a fun card. My guess is this is more of a like weird, fun build-around type effect, and against the odd style card, let's say, than something that's a real staple. Although, I do think maybe some sort of landfall ramp style deck, if there is a top-tier home, a competitive home for it, some sort of rampy landfall deck, where you can cast this for a bunch of mana, draw a bunch of cards, trigger your Morag a bunch of times, your Falith a bunch of times, your Lotus Cobra a bunch of times, to like pseudo combo off. If there is a competitive home, I bet that that's it, but definitely a really fun, weird, unique card with tons of sneaky synergies. So I really like this one, even if it probably isn't going to be a top-tier standard staple. Otherwise today, in the world of rares, we have a pretty interesting mana rock, Sky Glaive Relic, 3 mana, indestructible, taps to add a mana of any color, and if you kick it for 3 mana, so 6 total mana, you get 2 token copies of it. They come into play tap, but whatever, that's like not a super huge deal. So you can get 1 3 mana rock, or 3 essentially 2 mana rocks if you have 6 mana up front to pay for them, which is actually pretty powerful. So this is essentially a Darksteel Ingot with a massive upside of potentially giving you 2 mana rocks, which is something we don't really get in Standard. I don't know what this actually does for Standard because we have so much insane ramp. So with Uros and Cultivates, even with the kicker upside, is this enough for it to see play in Standard? I'm not actually sure. However, in Commander, people still play Darksteel Ingot sometimes, and if you're playing Darksteel Ingot, I feel like this is a easy replacement, and I think this is arguably a replacement for some other 3 mana rocks as well. If you can kick it and get 3 copies, you're getting pretty close to building your own Gilded Lotus. Yes, most of it comes into play on tap, but you're getting 3 mana for 6 mana. That's really powerful, and that doesn't even include any synergies for having additional artifacts on the battlefield. So Sky Glaive Relic, yes, it's a 3 mana rock. Yes, it might not be good enough for Standard just because there's so many ramp spells that are busted in Standard, but it is a really sweet, really powerful card, and if you can kick it, it can be very powerful. We also got one of the better mill spells we've seen in a long time, Maddening Cacophony. So, Maddening Cacophony, 2 mana, mills 8 cards from each opponent, kicker of 4, so for 6 mana, each opponent is going to mill half of their library rounded up. So, Maddening Cacophony, it's essentially breaking, the breaking half of breaking and entering, milling 8 for 2, or 1 extra mana for a Traumatize with the upside of hitting all your opponents if you're playing Commander, which is nice, and the upside that this isn't targeted. So remember, in like modern mill decks, one of the things that can get around these targeted mill effects is Leyline of Sanctity, for example, stuff that keeps you from targeting a player, gives that player hexproof. Maddening Cacophony gets around that easily. I think this is actually a really good mill card. The first thing that comes to mind is combos with Burvac or with Fraying Sanity, where if you can kick this with Burvac or Fraying Sanity on the battlefield, Burvac, you kill one opponent. Burvac, you kill literally everyone, but Fraying Sanity, you kill whoever has been enchanted with it. In a 2-player game, like in Historic, you just kill anyone straight up, as just straight up win the game, which is pretty powerful. That's a 3 mana spell with a 6 mana spell, counting the kicker cost, that just wins the game on the spot. And the upside is, unlike Traumatize, the comparison for Maddening Cacophony, you have the flexibility of being able to cast it for 2 mana. Maybe you don't have your other combo piece, you still have an on-curve mill effect, and that on-curve mill effect might actually mean that Maddening Cacophony Cacophony shows up in Modern mill decks, kind of the gold standard for mill in Modern is Glimpse the Unthinkable, milling 10 for 2 mana. It isn't 2 colors, Maddening Cacophony isn't quite there, but the milling half your library is an upside, and milling 8 is pretty close, so I wouldn't be surprised to see if Modern mill decks, especially ones with Fraying Sanity, to take advantage of the combo potential of kicking it to just mill everything in one turn, would want to add this into their decks as well. So this is, honestly, one of the best mill spells we've seen in a long time. It might be the best mill spell we've seen in a long time. So if you're looking at just emptying your opponent's library, this card's going to be really good, potentially across formats, thanks to that on-curve starting rate and the kicker flexibility. We also got our blue Inscription of Insight. So 4 mana sorcery, kicker of 4, so 4 mana or 8 mana. If you don't kick it, you have to choose one, return up to 2 target creatures to their owner's hands, scry 2 and draw 2 cards. Target player creates an XX blue illusion token where X is the number of cards in their hand. If you kick it, you could choose any number of them. So if it's kicked, you're getting what? A 5 for 1? You're bouncing 2 of your opponent's things theoretically, or your own stuff for value, scrying 2 and drawing 2, making a token. I think it's a 5 for 1. So that is a pretty powerful card, and one of the ways we've been evaluating the Inscription cycle is comparing each of their modes to past cards, and in this regard, Inscription actually holds up really well. So bouncing 2 creatures, that's mostly a 4 mana spell. So Inscription, that mode is on curve. Drawing 2 and scrying 2, mostly a 4 mana spell. Yes, Glimmer of Genius is an instant, so that's a bit of a drawback, but still, you would expect to pay 4 mana for scry 2, draw 2 cards, and then the token making ability is kind of like Commence the Endgame, I think is the closest comparison. Yes, you don't get the card draw built into it unless you kick it, but still, another very powerful effect that is arguably even undercosted on Inscription of Insight. So if you combine this all together, you have 3 different modes that are already playable, like Glimmer of Genius saw play, Commence the Endgame does have upsides, but that have seen play. Into the Void hasn't really seen play, but most of the modes are playable on their own, and as a bonus, you get this kicker upside. When you kick it and do it all, it is going to be absolutely insane. So I think Inscription of Insight probably still behind the green Insight for best Insight we've seen so far, but it's a really good card. All the modes are on curve. They're all worth the 4 mana cost, and then if you kick it and get that 5 for 1, you're probably just going to win the game. So I expect this one to actually have a chance at seeing play. In standard at minimum, it's a really good, really flexible option. Last but not least today, in the world of lower rarity cards, we got our mouse, Canyon Germoa, and it's actually good, better than I thought. 3 mana for a 1/2 mouse with landfall that you get to give all of your creatures +1/+1 until end of turn, along with sweet promo art. So this is kind of like a creaturey retreat to Emeria. Yes, you give up some upside, you're not getting the token or having the option to make a token, but a 3 mana creature that pumps everything when a land comes into play, I think that is close to being good enough to see play in standard. And that doesn't even include that it's a mouse, and it's really cute and really funny, and we've never had it before in Magic, and look at that art, look at that mouse art! Otherwise, we get a bunch more partner stuff. Journey to Oblivion, it's like a bad banishing, like it being a good one if you have a bunch of party stuff on the battlefield. Drana Silencer, good limited only card. Stonework Past Beast, another card that gives you all of your party types to help you assemble a party in limited. Otherwise, some more limited focus stuff. Moss Pit Skeleton looks close to being playable. 2 mana 2/2 that if it was kicked, comes into play with 3 counters. So 5 mana 5/5 or 2 mana 2/2. Doesn't sound too bad. And then whenever one or more counters are put on creatures you control, if it's in your graveyard, you can put it on top of your library. That last ability really kills it for me. If it was returned to your hand, I would be all about this card, and it would see play, but I'm not sure how often, if ever, you're going to want to put Moss Pit Skeleton on top of your deck, and then have to draw it the next turn, and then have to cast it again. So I feel like it's so close to being really sweet, and its rate's not bad, especially in limited, 2 mana 2/2, 5 mana 5/5, but the fact that it goes on top of your deck instead of to your hand really kills its constructed potential. Anyway, I think that brings us to the end of our daily Zendikar Rising spoilers for today. So what do you think about all of these ridiculous cards? List aforementioned. What are you going to copy? Spells, permanents, activated triggered abilities. What about Akiri, Fearless Voyager? Can equipment be a thing in standard, or is that just going to be mostly a card for Commander? How about Maddening Cacophony? Is that the best mill card we've seen? I don't know, in years? Can it show up in combo decks with Fraying Sanities and Burvac? What about our blue Inscription? How strong is that? Is the fact that most of its sides are already on rate gonna have Let's See Plan Standard? What about Wayward Guide Beast? How good is our absolutely horrible Goblin Guide? Am I missing something? Is it better than I think? Nahiri's Lithoforming, putting a bunch of lands into play. What shenanigans can we pull off with that? All the lower rarity stuff, let me know about that as well. Thanks so much for watching. I'll be back tomorrow with more Zendikar Rising spoilers. Until then, have a great day, and I will talk to you soon.
Thanks for watching the video. If you enjoyed it, help us out by clicking that like button down below. And to keep up on all the latest and greatest, click that subscribe button. And don't forget to hit that bell icon to get alerts whenever we have new videos. And if you want to, check out some of our other sweet videos here and here.